And if anything, we spend the least amount of time on the most interesting, which is the White Walkers.
Which is the White Walkers, yeah. I mean, like they were completely just sidelined in this whole
my God.
conflict.
Especially in the TV show, which
Exactly.
I really hope the final book, if it ever shows up, like actually like does something a little more interesting.
I'm convinced the show at this
than the
point like
ghastly.
has bombed so badly that like G.R.R. Martin has to like kind of recalibrate what he was going to do with the story.
Yeah. Yeah, it certainly does sound like that. They really botched that last season. My God. I did a whole like fan fiction thread on Twitter when the last season aired, like where I like presented my own fixed version of the last season. It was all about the White Walkers because I'm like, that's the interesting part of it for me.
Like they're
That
the
was the
main
build-up
thread.
for 5 seasons.
Yes.
They're the main thread. They're supposed to be like your politics and all of this like political gaming is like secondary to what is the main
secondary to climate change.
secondary to climate change. Yeah.
How do you solve climate change? Stamp it.
Apparently stand it. That was not good.
Hello and welcome again to another episode of the Q&A podcast. Today we are here to discuss not only magic, mystery and myth, but also legends and much more. We have a fantasy author with us here, Vajra Chandrasekera, and also with me as always, Faraway Q.
Hello.
Thank you for having me.
It's great to have you.
It's great to have you, and I think we've managed to catch you up at the best time possible because you have a book that's out right now in the world, ready for you guys to read. You can find his link down in the description below if you want to catch it and find it interesting to read. But we have gone through the book, so we are going to be having a spoiler-heavy discussion of some things. But like we'll leave some things up in the air for you to find out afterwards. So, Vajra, so tell us about yourself and how you found yourself in this writing sphere and in writing South Asian fantasy.
I'm from Colombo, Sri Lanka. I've been publishing short stories for about 10 years now. I think my first one came out in 2013. I've been publishing mostly in the West, in magazines, anthologies, that sort of thing. This is my first novel. It just came out in July. I've been working on it technically since about 2016, but I wrote the bulk of it in 2020. In fact, in the first few months of the pandemic. So everyone went a little mad during the first few months of the pandemic, during the lockdown. This was me. My pandemic project was this book. I was like, you know what? Like, this is the apocalypse. We're all going to die. I'm going to write this goddamn book and finish it.
That explains some of the themes.
Yes,
Definitely explains a lot of the plague going on in the book.
Yes, I mean it was impossible to like not mention like the plague, and it feels I think relevant even now because like very little has changed on that front. But yeah, so it's not a pandemic book, but it's certainly like the pandemic is very present in it, along with I like to think as much of South Asian. Sri Lankan and South Asian politics, especially post-colonial politics, history and culture, as I could possibly squeeze into it.
Nice. I mean, like we see a lot of the pandemic allegories going on in the book, and as well as other parts of the history that are like less talked about, I guess, maybe in Sri Lankan culture. What got you initially into fantasy novels and fantasy in general? Like, what drew you towards this medium versus like other like non-fiction mediums or even like speculative fiction or something else of the likes?
Well, I wouldn't say that I particularly prefer fantasy over the other speculative fiction forms. I was into science fiction, fantasy, and horror very young. I think at the appropriate age, like whatever, like 12, 13 or whatever, when you first start reading, like, on your own, like at volume. So library books, mostly in my case, and secondhand books. I've never been... as a reader or a writer, someone who makes a very sharp distinction between the different kinds of speculative fiction, the science fiction, the horror, the fantasy. For me, all of these things kind of blend together. I don't draw sharp lines. There are differences, obviously, but I think the differences are more of mood or attitude than actual content. Because, for example, a lot of classic science fiction from the mid 20th century in actual scientific terms is pretty much fantasy.
Exactly.
And
yeah.
yeah, and a lot of fantasy for that matter is like dark enough that it's basically horror.
I mean, you can
Um,
see that a lot in your book as well. I mean, when I was going
Yeah,
through it,
yeah.
like I couldn't exactly pin down what genre this fell into. Like I was expecting more of like a cookie cutter like book as like your first book, because people tend to play it safe. But like you ventured into very different territories overall. Like it went from being like speculative fiction and about the future of the nation, and also like from it had very high fantasy elements added in it as well, which were very like deeply melded into the book and then as the society inside the book. One thing also that like really drew me towards the book was that like you dealt with a lot of themes in throughout the book, with very politically charged themes, apocalyptic themes, and also as well as like other religious based themes as well, very heavily like religious allegory, like borderline religious allegory. But like one thing that like I think always comes back up in your writing that I've read so far is that like you deal a lot with wealth and class inequality. Like these are constant subjects that you are bringing up, and also along with it with the conflict, I guess, between state and religion, which contribute to one another. So one thing that I also like found was that the climate crisis, you could say, was also like a very hard sticking point. Like even in your, I think, short story, The Translator, you deal with like the eroding shoreline, and also with the sands area inside the in the book. It also has like a receding shoreline that's being eaten up by the sea. So like I saw like different mirrorings of this fact throughout your entire writing, and also like the fact there's like climate catastrophes happening and people are moving away from areas which are affected to least affected areas and having refugees present. I would want to ask you specifically, like out of these themes, which themes do you think are more, not more important, but like which things would you think have a higher priority in your understanding of the world?
Okay, so a lot of people think that fantasy is meant to be an escapist literature, right? Something that takes you away from the world. And yeah, some of it is written that way. It's meant to be entertaining and so forth. And it's not that I'm not trying to be entertaining, obviously. All technically, this is show business. We're all trying to entertain, like, the people who are reading the story. But at the same time, like, I think for myself, like, I belong to the whatever traditions of fiction, fantasy fiction inclusive, that are about using the devices of fiction in whatever genre to kind of bring out the world more, to focus on the world. So it's about coming back to the world for me. Like there may be fantasy elements or like things that we don't like, devils or magic or whatever, but fundamentally for me all my work is about the real world. And like the real world, like all these things, class inequality, capitalism, imperialism, colonialism, climate change, all of this is of a piece, right? You can't really separate like any of the aspects from it's a singular kind of, this is the world as we live in it. And understanding any part of it essentially is just pulling on, like you pull on one end and then you find like that just leads you to all the other ends.
Exactly. Yeah.
So it depends on the specific focuses might change depending on the story you're telling. For example, I have written stories that were very much like short, especially the very short ones. Because in very short stories, you don't have a lot of space to talk about multiple things, so you focus on one thing. So I have written stories that were very much about climate change, for example, or the military-industrial complex, or whatever. Just this one thing. But at novel length, you have the in some ways it's a luxury, because I've spent like a long time writing very short stories, and very short stories are an art form in themselves, because you have to kind of like deliver like a certain kind of experience within like 1,000 words or 1,500 words, which is like a skill set in itself. It's very different from writing a novel. In a novel, you have room to explore like a theme and bring in all the everything that you think like plays into that. So in this story, which is about a great many things, but like some very fundamental levels about history and politics, I felt compelled to bring in like everything that touches that, which is pretty much like
which is pretty much
as-
everything.
everything. Yeah.
Exactly, yeah. I mean,
Yeah.
like there's
Yeah,
like I think I saw like a post the other day, like people like bitch about being in political, but at the same time they say they backbite about their landlords, their bosses, their work, and the climate and everything. I mean, everything inherently is political, and everything is interconnected with one another, and they interdepend on each other. So then these it's not a singular crisis that needs to be like, I guess, addressed or absolved, but it's like rather a wide range of crises which exist and coexist together. So we have to tackle all of them at the same time.
Yeah, I think that's partly the job of like art, is to relentlessly demonstrate the interconnectedness of these things, because the tunnel vision that comes from like focusing on one thing as at the expense of others is an actual like danger to like political thought and like like social like life, right? So I think one of the many functions of art is to show that the ways in which like these things are interconnected and draw those out.
Yeah, South Asian cultures have such a strong history of storytelling, and storytelling can provide a vessel when you talk about them bare bones. But if you put them into allegories, you can confront the excesses of the religion doctrine you follow without feeling personally attacked by it. We live in a very complex society, right? There's just by the number of people there, the complexity arises. And in my mind, you're telling a story, there's going to be some trajectory through this complexity that you're going to follow. You can either average over these details, present a simplified world. You could have a narrative that is very local, but winds through these complexities. What makes you choose one over the other?
I think it's a bit of both in a way, because for example, classic like literary fiction, right, like tends to focus on the particular, and that means usually like like you tell the story of like I don't know, like take a well-known example like The God of Small Things. It's about like the caste and like this particular village and this particular family, and that's a very kind of I love that book incidentally, but like it's very it's a style that I think a lot of fantasy doesn't work in, because fantasy tends to go the other way and like work with like big abstractions. So religion becomes the religion, the big like cult or whatever, and like there's no like or like politics boils down to one like system of politics, or like one like set of like families or whatever, like very like even like a book like Game of Thrones, for example.
I was just about to bring up Game of Thrones.
Which is like Game of Thrones is generally considered like one of the more politically complicated stories, right?
Yeah.
But it's actually like, I mean, if you get right down to it, it's like extremely simplified like political structure, because I mean, it's basically the what is it, the War of the Roses, which is like one local conflict in like British history, expanded to be like a world-sized conflict. It's just like you could like literally list every player, and like the book does. Right, like we painstakingly work our way through every player in this conflict, and if anything, we spend the least amount of time on the most interesting, which is the White Walkers.
White Walkers, yeah. I mean, like they were completely just sidelined in this whole conflict.
Especially in the TV show, which I
Exactly.
really hope the final book, if it ever shows up, like actually like does something a little more interesting.
I'm convinced the show at this point like
ghastly.
has bombed so badly that like G.R.R. Martin has to like kind of recalibrate what he was going to do with the story.
Yeah, it certainly does sound like that. They really botched that last season. My God. I did a whole like fan fiction thread on Twitter when the last season aired, like where I like presented my own fixed version of the last season. It was all about the White Walkers, because I'm like, that's the interesting part of it for me.
Like they're
That
the
was the
main
build-up
thread.
for 5 seasons.
Yes.
They're the main thread. They're supposed to be like your politics and all of this like political gaming is like secondary to what is the main
secondary to climate change.
secondary to
Yeah.
climate change. Yeah.
How do you solve climate change? Stand it.
Apparently stand it. That was not good.
So you think you also deal with a lot of like, I guess you mentioned in there like in this answer that you might deal with a lot with political and I guess religious complexities that come in life, and I found that myself in the book that like whereas most most fantasy and also science fiction has very simplified governing rules or very simplified politics and religion. Like, you delve into the fact that there are multiple religions and they're all competing with one another, especially with the unchosen group that the therapy group that they have. I mean, like, just coming across that as a sentence was like a mild, like, like, what's going on? There's so many unchosen in this world that there's like a small therapy group for them. Like, what's going on? So, like, the conflicts, I guess, within religion and also with being unchosen, I guess, like, is Fetter's main story arc, you could say, and how he confronts not having a destiny of his own, but rather one that was given to him by other people. Like, before we go into I guess the deeper dive into religion and the politics of it, I wanted to, I guess, talk more about indoctrination and the act of indoctrination. Because, like, one point in the book, like, I think Fetter comes to realize that, like, he is operating on indoctrinated processes and pathways that, like, that are ingrained into him since childhood, and you can see that popping up again and again. But it's like in which he all of a sudden thought spirals and thinks about, like, oh, like, if my mother Glory said that we needed to go, that I needed to go and kill the perfect and kind, and essentially a weapon, I guess, made in order to achieve this purpose. But then he has, like, shakes himself out of it and says, like, no, I'm not that. I'm now, like, Fetter. I'm now this person who is now in front of me, and he has multiple personalities, like, that form, I guess, around him during this whole process. I guess, like, his introspection and understanding of being indoctrinated, I guess, maybe is a very interesting point from understanding that we're all indoctrinated in some sense in our own religion, in our own cultures, in our own political histories, whatever it is. And I guess very few people take that chance to introspect or interrogate it further to tear it apart. One thing, I guess,
it's fine. It's fine that we're indoctrinated. It's when that indoctrination is weaponized in one way or another.
Exactly. I mean, that indoctrination is weaponized. So, like, I wanted to take your take on it, that, like, you talk about religion and politics. So, like, how do you feel that's being weaponized or taken advantage of in the modern day, you could say? And how did you explore that in the story?
Well, I mean, if you you could, I mean, this is like a big simplification, but you could say in a way the book is about, like, how parents weaponize children against each other in the fundamental sort of, like, dysfunctional family dynamic is that each parent is trying to use, like, the child against the other parent.
Exactly, yeah.
And you become like a little child soldier in this war that your parents are having, and that's writ large. That is kind of the plot of the book. Because that's also, like, what, like, is happening societally at, like, on a broader scale, is that you're brought up into a belief system, and most of us, like, it takes, like, a lot of work to question the belief system you were brought up into, and usually, at least I think for me, like, that point came when on realizing how much violence underlies that system and how much violence that system is used for. Each parent has, like, a specific destiny in mind for Fetter. His father basically, like, chooses, like, to cut him out because essentially he doesn't want to well, I don't know, like, that's arguable, I suppose.
The perfect and kind essentially said that Fetter was his last chain to this earthly world, and then he had to, like, sever that chain. Yeah,
hence Fetter kind of thing, his last chain to kind of, like, convention or, like, societal expectation, fatherhood, and all that. So he answers this by leaving. But you'll note that, like, Fetter also comes back to his childhood indoctrination later in life, right?
Exactly.
He rejects it, and then he comes back to it. Does he come back to it because as a considered choice, or because his mother's pressuring him, or because he chose it out of, like, like a reasoned process? That this is unclear, even to me, like, because I don't think, like, anyone is all that clear about why we do things sometimes, why we take the life decisions we take. Like, you can, and I think many people do, like, more or less successfully break out of a certain degree of childhood indoctrination in early adulthood, but some people don't. But, like,
I mean,
many of us do.
it's a point of like falling into familiar patterns, you could say. Like
Kind of
people,
thing, yeah.
yeah. Like
But like even after you break out of it, it's never gone, right?
Yeah.
Like that's
Yeah.
still a part of your history. That's still a part of how you're made. So it's very easy to kind of slip back into patterns. And you have to be even more introspective to figure out, like, am I doing this thing because I want to do it, because I think I should do it, because I'm expected to do it, because some people I respect or love, some even against my better instincts maybe want me to do it. So, and I think this is very I'm sure this is like a common experience to like everyone, but like especially South Asians who I think grow up with like a fairly heavy dose of parental
Exactly,
and
yeah.
familial expectation. Um,
You have to become a doctor or an engineer or a lawyer. That's it. There's no other acceptable profession.
My parents had the same the same reaction, and you guys actually are a doctor.
Exactly.
and well, a physicist, but that's like, like you were
Small
saying, how
difference.
a small difference.
Small difference.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I mean, you do have it's not just a moral decision, it's a promise of community and belonging if you fall back into your old patterns.
Yeah, exactly. I mean,
And-
there are rewards to being to following like a set pattern. There are many rewards to it, right? Like
Exactly.
like that. Whereas like following your own path, quite often there are no rewards to it beyond whatever sense of
Self-satisfaction that you gain. Yeah.
satisfaction that you can gain, and that can be very thin sometimes in the face of societal or familial disapproval. So it can be a very hard and very lonely path to take, which I think is what eventually like Fetter does take.
Exactly.
But it certainly isn't easy, and it's not, and he doesn't get that far undamaged, right? Like he's actually very damaged by the end of it.
I was just about to say that. I mean, Fetter is like a very deeply damaged character overall, but like he is one,
not just emotionally,
not
but
just
like also
emotionally, but
physically.
like in every respect and regard. Like even by the very end of the book, like you even see the toll that all of that has taken on him, like gathered up over the years. So like one thing that I also wanted to like get into with respect to Fetter was like his mental health issues, I guess you could say, and how that's become more of a talking point nowadays. I mean, and given more, I guess, given more importance, I guess, nowadays. Like we see a lot more fantasy novels dealing with people who have mental issues and people who have mental health issues and people who have other psychiatric issues. Like most times, like you even see a lot of main characters have them. In the case with Fetter as well. Like, I mean, at some point during the book, like I wasn't 100% sure if like if he was completely 100% sane while operating on it, because like you see him acting very lucidly and very like normally, but then like some certain situations would like trigger his inset indoctrination or trigger his trauma. And also like the second chapter is like very much just like an explanation of that. For example, he suppressed his entire teenage years, essentially, which was like also a very like cool literary, I guess, tool. Like I've never seen that used that much, because like, you know, having like just a one paragraph second chapter was like obviously it's trauma suppression. He can't remember all of this, then why would I write this?
Yeah, all he's like carrying away from that period are the scars, right?
Exactly.
Which he's obsessed by.
And then the scars conversation, I loved the scars conversation that he has. Like, you know, he has the context, he knows the context of those scars. Meanwhile, like everyone around him is just blissfully unaware why he has those scars. I mean, he could have easily gotten them by like some injury or some road accident or whatever, like falling out of like a car or something. But like people don't know that he's murdered people in order to get to that point. That's why he's scarred. So like having that context and that trauma, like I guess initially causes him to like, you know, like cover himself up, not show off his scars, and then afterwards he comes into his own and accepts them for his own. Then he begins to like wear sleeveless and also like begins showing them to the world, I guess. So one question I did want to get into with respect to Fetter and his like mental state was that, did his mom actually die? Like, this is heavily spoiler, and I guess maybe I might cut this out.
I think we can leave it out.
We can leave it out.
Yeah.
This is a question I actually want to know. We'll ask this question afterwards, I guess, or maybe in the Patreon card. Who knows? Okay, so moving on from there, you talk a lot about wealth inequality, and I guess this ties a lot into Fetter's character. like you understand that Fetter is an ambitious person, and then he also managed to find initially his calling as as a guide person in the sands. So like I was really like, it hurt me a lot to understand, like, you know, Fetter had to go the route that he did and leave his job as being a guide person in the sands, because like that was kind of like the perfect job made for him, like in that moment. And then a lot of people were calling him out to be that person, but like then the indoctrination kicks in with Coel, and then her giving him orders, and then he falls back into familiar patterns of, like, you know, this person has an agenda, I am here to fulfill said agenda. So one thing that like was like, I guess, an interesting point in this discussion was that, like, when he becomes Perot for a while in between as a researcher, he has the wealth and he has the upbringing and the acquired and the necessary, I guess, heritage in order to open up more doors of opportunity in his life. And you see what a changed person he is. Even in the city of Luriat, you say that like everyone has a universal basic income, and they're free to choose whatever they want, but they can also like work and earn money on top of that. So like I want to take your I guess more your I guess perspective on wealth inequality, and also I guess the social standing of people and how wealth inequality plays a major role in our lives.
One of the things I was trying to do with the Luriati social system is to present a system that something that at first glance looked like a positive or like appealing. So there's you have, everyone has like a basic income, there's like you know, you can get housing and food and so forth.
Sounded dope. Yeah.
It sounded, yeah, that sounds great. And then as you go along, you understand that all of this is based on a system of racial and caste classification that is very complex and very rigid, and is essentially determines your place in the society regardless. So I think like one of the ways in which I think like I'm also expressing my suspicion of how UBI type systems are sometimes proposed as kind of band-aids over to cover over like more fundamental inequities. The idea is that like, okay, so we're not going to like fundamentally change the way society works, but we will give you, but since in any case jobs are like getting scarcer, wages are getting lower, and like everyone's situation is more precarious, we'll buttress that with a basic income so that you have more money to consume with, while keeping the fundamental inequalities of like wealth, because there are rich people in Luriat, right? There are people who are like, there's old money and there's new money, there's industrialists, people who own the means of production, whatever that means. There's a military industrial complex, there's a government hierarchy of like, you know, bigwigs, and so all of that structure is still very much there. There's a military. So I think the seeming equalities of Luriat are basically like a facade for like very fundamental inequalities that have not changed and that are very familiar to us. And
so the UBI acts as a way to stop the working class from starving.
Yeah, and like basically like people are not going to riot like if they have like a roof over their heads and food, even if it's like, you know, like maybe the housing isn't so good. Maybe the food isn't so great or so nutritious or whatever. Maybe you don't have a lot of choices, but you have something. So like the sheer raw edge of desperation that drives people to get out in the street and like burn down the houses of the wealthy, that can be avoided by giving people basic income and a certain amount of like free stuff. So that is one of the reasons I think we will see, and I think we are seeing a lot of like Silicon Valley types pushing for basic income in the real world, is also the same kind of reasoning. You can take you can push people closer towards precarity and lower wages and fewer benefits, and fewer, like, you can reduce welfare and increase by providing basic income as well, right? You can say like, okay, you don't need free healthcare because you have basic income.
So like taking away rights and privileges that we already have in exchange for like,
and replacing it with cash.
Exactly.
And saying, yeah, why don't you pay for it with the free money? But it's like it's okay that you have to pay for it because you have the free money and you have like
Yeah.
certain basic guarantees that keep you alive and fed. Whereas the good life is for people who play the game, the people who get the good educations, who are born to like the wealthy families or whatever, like the. So I think this is one of the ways in which like seemingly progressive politics can play out. This is not an argument against basic income, full stop, but against like very, I think, increasingly common manifestations of the basic income argument, which is the use of it to deny like more fundamental social change that would bring like greater like equality.
Yeah, similar to the enclosures, right? You take away people's
exactly.
land, you promise them wages, but those wages are measly. The basic income won't mean anything in 10 years when inflation reduces its value.
Or like the way that AI is like AI, quote unquote AI, is acting as a new round of enclosure of white collar work. So it's another way to make like white collar work as precarious as blue collar work was like in factories by automation. So this way, like you can fire a whole bunch of people or like pay them less. Ideally, not even fire them. You not fire them and rehire them as editors to as freelance like people, to freelancers who will fix the AI like garbage.
Yeah. I mean, you're hiring editors to edit the AI's work. I mean, instead of having people.
And you can do that with like that turns like full-time gigs into contract gigs, and contract gigs are both more precarious and like more like easy, like because then once you've got freelancers competing on wages, and that's already happening with like prompt engineers, quote unquote, competing on like markets that are actually like open markets where people are competing for like AI prompts now as freelancers, which is
I looked into this a bit. I mean, you're like totally right on this point that like a lot of like our entire labor system has been shifted over into like a contract system. Like for example, with Uber and with like other like, contractual hires, for example, like that. Like I mean, you don't have workers anymore. You have people who are hired on contracts, and they have less I guess flexibility in order to pressurize their employers, because a lot of contract workers are not allowed to work and like operate and get union help, you could say, because they're not formally employed.
Power companies work the same way, right?
Exactly.
Like manpower companies as a way to sidestep like the formation of unions in, for example, like in the very traditional labor union like intensive areas like ports, like Sri Lankan ports use manpower companies for labor, just specifically to undercut and garbage collection, janitorial services. Exactly. This is all kind of like of a piece, I think, like an AI is part of that, and like a certain class of UBI type service, or like not it will give you something and it sounds superficially good, like like contract arguments are often like contractor based work is often like phrased in positive terms, like it's sold to you as like you get more freedom, you can decide your own hours,
like you get to be your own boss. This is the
you can be your own boss.
This is the line that's thrown around quite literally.
And a lot of people like and there's this horrific, I don't know if you guys saw this article about this like the people who freelancers who get the gigs to like train AI outputs to make like ChatGPT or whatever like usable. There was an article that was kind of expose about like freelancers in I think like I forget where, I think it was like Nigeria.
I was just
we interviewed some people. So there was one of those guys was interviewed, and he had this very heartbreaking line where he said something like, if these people, these mysterious people who hire me for like these gigs would only tell me like what exactly the project was and what they want to accomplish, I could like train myself, I could get better at this and build like a more like stable career doing this. And you're like, dude, bro, this is exactly what they don't want to give you, right?
Exactly.
Like that stability, the ability to build like a stable life for yourself, a career. This is literally what they are taking away from you. Like this whole system is like, this whole setup is like, and not only that, you are unwittingly participating in taking that stability away from other people. Right? This is the trap kind of thing. You're using each person's desire for stability against everybody else's.
And speaking of,
Yeah.
like, you do like delve a lot of that into the book. I mean, with Fetter's own financial situation and his own, like, he doesn't really have a stable job per se, other than like side gigs that he sometimes gets. Like, for example, underneath the as a research worker with under the identity of Perot, and also like he generally doesn't really have a stable career throughout the entire thing. I mean, you can even see that.
Yeah.
And all like the other people themselves, like even I think Kadov and also what was her name, Coel, she's also just like a playwright, and on the side she's probably doing something else which isn't explicitly mentioned, but like she's probably doing something else because like these
Yeah.
jobs are no longer paying, and there's like a degree of financial inequality and wealth inequality that goes into robbing these people of proper paying jobs and giving them to someone else who's probably like less qualified or underqualified just because of their upbringing or their caste, so to say, in the book
Yeah.
especially, because like
Yeah,
that's
and
why
like the unchosen all are all marginal, socially
Exactly.
marginal figures, right? Like none of them have any real like prospects or spending money or anything like that. I think Coel like has like through sheer like experience has parlayed like her artistic career into some social relevance, but everyone else is like very much on the fringes of this society,
Exactly.
as opposed to, for example, the people that Fetter, like when he's pretending to be Perot, the researcher, when he goes and meets these people who live very, very different lives.
Exactly.
Right? Like,
They live in their own walled off gardens, like unaware of like the suffering and also like the, I guess, social circumstances that other people in the city are like living. I mean, they live in their own walled gardens and they don't have any idea. I mean, even like I guess one or like bring up one of the peak moments of the book for me was like the scene between I think Koma and what was his name again? Tomarin, I think. Koma, Tomarin, and Garau. Which there he it was
the
like a very
party.
high, yeah, the dinner party was an amazing, I guess, like a moment where, like, you know, I mean, you think that these people have like everything sorted and they're like these nefarious plans being hatched and these plots being carried out, but instead it's just like very casual conversation about very serious things, flippantly, like, I mean, without nonchalantly mentioning like, oh, get this person to do this thing so then we can like figure out our own plans. And then like you see this casualness and callousness, I guess, in their conversation towards other people,
The
that
banality of evil.
the banality of
And
evil.
I think like
mean,
that's
and it's
that's,
just
like if you've ever been around like, you know, rich people like chat, it's very there's a very kind of like it's both incredibly banal and like almost like nauseatingly so, but at the same time like frightening how much power is being casually thrown about, like
exactly.
by people like who like like this is not like an elected kind of power. This is it's not even like social power necessarily in like in the sense that, for example, religious leader would have. These are people whose names are not on in the newspapers, people whose these are just kind of like the upper middle class of society who are or like the senior functionaries of government, not the ministers and the, you know, not the people who will make the papers.
Yeah,
but
people
like
who are like accountable, you could say.
Yeah, not the people who would, at least people would try to hold accountable, but the people just a level below that whose names nobody knows, and who are who make decisions every day that affect the lives of like God knows how many people. So that was like Fetter's very small window into that world, and he's like completely out of his depth. He has no idea how to deal with it at all.
I mean, at that point, Fetter's main strategy was just smile and wave, boys. Just smile and wave.
Yeah, just smile and wave. just try not to die. You know, just try not to say anything that will get you arrested. Pretend like you know what's happening.
And like even afterwards, like you see like the favor that's granted to Fetter was that Garau gave him like a free premium pass to like the sermon that the Perfect and Kind would give on like when he came to the city. I mean, that was like very casually just handed out, and like a lot of these people, like you can see that a large amount of power that is gathered in these centers, it's not even accountable, and then like it's used very casually between each other. Like even afterwards when you realize that Koma's research was collaborating with, I think, Garau in order to get the relic aid handed over to the perfect kind, I think.
Yeah.
So you
like
see,
there seems to be a conflict, but
Mhm.
there, like between these various like factions or players in the sort of upper class, but the see what looks like a conflict from below isn't really a conflict. It's more like just banter. Like they're really kind of on the same side in the like in the long run or even in the medium run. They do have interests that differ, but those are minor compared to the interests that they share.
like class solidarity, you could say, in
Yeah,
essence.
essentially, it's class solidarity of the upper class. The upper class is very good at class solidarity, and everybody much better than everybody else.
And then at every like minor turn that we try to gain solidarity between the working class, like they're like, no, you're not allowed to do that. You're a hyper individualistic individual. You're your own personal self, and you could do it yourself.
And compete like. And you have to be competitive and like be like a entrepreneur.
You have to be you have to be cutthroat. Like, I mean, that is the narrative that's passed on to the most people now. Like, you have to be competitive in the market. You have to be better than others. You have to put other people down in order to move forward in life. Like, these are like the lessons that we all learn inadvertently from being in our social standing, I guess. But like afterwards, you understand like there's no like cutthroat competition going on at the top. I mean, they're all working in it together. Like, what's that going on over there? Like, your book
is socialism for the rich or something. That was a famous quote. I forget who by, right?
Exactly. Socialism, I mean, like there's socialism exists only for the rich, and not only that, there's like privatized gains and socialized losses, you could say.
Yeah.
So like another thing that you brought up, I guess, right now would be like, I think you mentioned that these classes and people, they seem to be colluding with one another in order to operate. There are revolutionary undertones in your novel, I guess, in trying to start a revolution with Koel and Kadov, and also their respective network of I guess operatives wouldn't be like the right word, but like their respective people who are in their revolution. I guess this is more slightly personal, I guess. This would on the side of being personal. Like, would your perspective on the revolution and the way it was being organized come from like the protests in 2022 in Sri Lanka?
Well, no, because I wrote this before that. I wrote this like 2 years before the big protest, and I actually said that in like in an article that was published on Tor.com. It was really the protests were very strange for me because I found myself wandering around on the streets, looking at cars on fire and stuff, and being like, I actually wrote this scene like 2 years ago. This is so weird. But yeah, I mean, this is not the first time that Sri Lanka has seen protests on that scale. Certainly, it's been quite some time. Certainly, in my lifetime, it's the first time. But it's not the first time that we've seen unrest. Mostly, unrest has meant pogroms, and pogroms has meant state-sponsored pogroms. Violence on the street is not new, and like revolutionary politics is also not new. We've had several takes on it, shall we say, over the last like few decades. So I was drawing on all of that, the memory of like of the 80s and 90s, and the violence and the, I guess, like both the, like my understanding both then and now of like the revolutionary aspirations and their failures in execution. Leftist politics has had a very tumultuous history in Sri Lanka. I had no doubt in South Asia in general.
I mean, in general, I think
in general, yeah. So like that complicated history is one thing I was trying to show in the book. And one thing about the revolution in the book is that Fetter is not a major player. Right?
Exactly.
He's a marginal player in like a kind of like a group that is itself kind of marginal to whatever is going on, right? They play a part, but it's not the main part. That their main job is to be there and to participate and to do what they can in this in this upheaval, and try to kind of push it in the direction that they want, which I think is kind of what like a lot of real life politics is also like you're never like in control of anything really. All you can do is like shout as loud as you can and like try to like uh, argue for your position to kind of like push other people in the direction that you think is best and to make your arguments for your case. But you never get to kind of like revolutionary, like the depictions of revolutions in fiction are often also very simplified, right? You have like they're usually told from the perspective, especially in fantasy, I think, like told from the perspective of the front. Like you tell the story from the front.
Yeah, the first main leader, like the main character is usually like the revolutionary leader of like the people.
Kind of thing, yeah. And I'm trying to tell that story from kind of way off on the side over here. Like here's some guy who's just trying not to die, and like, and he gets his ass kicked like a lot. Like, so and that kind of ties back into the indoctrination question you asked earlier, because quite apart from like I think the politics, I'm also kind of trying to do something kind of structural or like literary here, which is that like a lot of stories that are like this book is in many ways both a criticism of fantasy and a love letter to fantasy, as like as I've read it and as I've understood it, of the fantasy of this type, both the high and low fantasy, which talks about politics and revolution. It's like I'm trying to say like I'm trying to follow in a different tradition of like, so like a lot of stories are about like like childhood assassins or like heroes trained in like from an early age to fight and to do magic and they grow up and then they have these big heroic battles and they lose some and then they finally win. So I'm trying to tell kind of like a similar story, but like off on the side over here. And here's a guy who was in fact trained to do violence and magic from childhood, except it fucked him up and he had to go to therapy. And he didn't really end up at the front of the revolution. The revolution was somebody else's. He did his best to help. Whether he actually helped or not is really a matter of interpretation. And I think the people who actually were at leading or like guiding that revolution, we don't even know who they are. Might have different opinions about that, but from his perspective, he's doing what he can. And he has his own political growth to deal with in that process. And for him, really, that's like the core of this is his own like his learning of like how to relate to the world, which I think is for most people like a more immediate problem than how to design and lead the revolution, because we don't really get to do that in real life. You don't get to design and lead the revolution. You get to like read books and like learn and like how to kind of like try to understand the world a little better and how to share that understanding with the people that you know and work with and live with, and just I guess try to do your best, which is what Fetter is doing. So it's also like very much the story of like somebody who, despite like this whole like narrative of like chosen ones and grand like politics, is on the margins of his own like what ought to have been his own story in a different and more conventional narrative. Is on the margins of that story.
Exactly. He's not only marginalized from his own destiny, like he's marginalized in every sense of the word. Like you can see it. Like he's marginalized in terms of his like his wealth, his like his class, his like basically everything. His entire identity is to be marginalized, and then you see like how the marginalized person, I guess, interprets their own identity free from the indoctrination that he was brought up with, and free from like, I guess, the political pressures and also the social pressures that a lot of people have in their life. And I guess like the main story arc that you see of Fetter throughout this entire book is probably like him trying to find his place in the world in like this extremely complicated and complex world, where like it's like I love the point that like you show that at multiple points that he fails, and like he never like even at the end I don't think he truly succeeds in doing what he wants to do, but like
he doesn't really. It's technically it's somebody else who succeeds.
Exactly. It's someone else who succeeds like in figuring out how to do it. But like I guess that's a very more realistic story, as you said. Like I mean that's the angle that you're trying to aim for. But like you also bring up very abstract concepts, like you could say like the religious aspects and the perfect and the kind. Like he embodies, I guess, maybe the Buddhist like intentions and like religious political stance that like most people in parliament, like in higher power structures of Sri Lanka might have. But
Yeah.
one thing that like I don't understand was that like, was the Perfect Kind more of an allegory to like the occupiers in Sri Lanka, or like was he the embodiment of like religious fanaticism and like its eventual
Oh, he's
end?
both, right?
Yeah, yeah.
He's both. He's an amalgamation of multiple sort of Sri Lankan or Buddhist mythic or historical figures. So, yeah, and he represents multiple waves of. Well, I'm not technically sure if you can call it colonialism, because like we generally use colonialism to refer to this specific historical period of like Western Europe colonizing together with the Enlightenment, the Industrial Revolution, all of that, and like the multiple waves of it. The Portuguese, the Dutch, the British, and everybody else, and the French, and so forth. So like, but before that, there have also been other. Historical and mythical. So, for example, Sri Lanka has an origin myth of its own, right? About like this prince who comes down from North India somewhere. The specific location is mythic and uncertain, but I think like conventionally it's placed somewhere in Bengal, the Vajra kingdom. So this prince who is exiled, and Prince Vajra who lands, whose boat lands in Sri Lanka on the day of the Buddha's death. That's our origin myth. So there's a lot to it, but like that kind of story. So the idea is that like these people came on a boat and killed all the locals and took over, intermarried with whoever they didn't kill, and then took over, and that's how the Sinhalese, quote unquote, came into being. So this is the origin myth of our historical mythic text, the Mahavansa, which was itself translated only in the 19th century and was very much, I think, like interpreted in the light of British colonial thinking about history and race and what race even means, because what race means in British colonial thought is very different from what it might have meant before.
Exactly,
which is something more like a feudal imaginary of like like allegiances to thrones and very the Starks and the Lannisters kind of thing. Like the Starks and the Lannisters are not races, right? You can't be like racially a Lannister, but you can be racially a Sinhalese. Practically, like those are the same kinds of thing. It's just historically, like for essentially colonial reasons, we think of them as different kinds of things. One of them is like a biological thing, and the other thing is a political thing. So that's why the Perfect Kind represents multiple like things at the same time. Because I'm not trying to create like a one-to-one mapping of this character is the other, is this refers to this one thing and so forth. So it's more like this overall kind of like arc tries to encapsulate what all these various waves of like violence, historical migrations, invasions, and then eventually the Western the imperialism of the colonial era, and then the post-colonial violence of like which inherited certain things from the colonial era and also reinterpreted its own past in the light of like colonial theories of race and religion. So what we have today is this weird mishmash of the past, of different pasts overlaid on top of each other and interpreted in the light of each other. Like the way we see our own deep past now is very much seen through the lens of like several hundred years of colonial inheritance and education and indoctrination.
I guess like a very eloquent way to kind of put this would be like each interpretation or lens is kind of like a stained glass through which you're looking into the past, and then how that changes and changes the interpretation of what is in the past or what actually was. Influences a lot, and a lot of our, I guess, South Asian cultures derive our primary lens from, I guess, post-colonial independence and also like colonialism itself. And
and that's the deal with the bright doors, right? With the reference to the empty realms as lost histories. The thing with lost histories is that you can never actually get them back in the same way, right? You can maybe access them, but they are monstrous to us.
Exactly.
Right?
Yeah, I mean, like, even like with the fact that like those beings from those lost histories, when they come into our world, they're like transformed fundamentally, and you see them as devils and like as the invisible powers and other names which are given to them. And how, like, I guess you could say that how Fetter interacts with the lost histories is kind of like how we all interact with our own history, because because like he sees them as devils and monsters and something evil and something to be like shunned, because like that's something that like when he moves to Luria, a lot of the people there like view it in a similar sense, that like people from Agustab are backwards and like they're regressive and they're like savages and barbarians. But like instead, like you understand that like from Mother of Glory's story later on, when in the book, that she mentions that like, you know, these things we all used to live in together with the harmony with the devils, with these unseen powers. So I guess struggling with that sense is more like a very, it's very difficult, I guess. Like even I myself, you could say, like I'm not fully 100% comfortable with my own like past histories, you could say. I mean, we're still trying to struggle and trying to find out and figure it out, like where we came from, where like what's our understanding of it. And I guess that's like a lot of labor that many people aren't willing to do. But I mean, even just putting that thought to begin with is, I guess, a step in the right direction. But one more thing that I wanted to get into before like we move on, I guess, would be that like what kind of mythos and mythology like did you draw upon to create this book, I guess? Like what kind of local culture, local myths and legends, and also like folklore that you drew upon to like inform this book?
Nothing too directly, I would say. I mean, it's obviously like heavily based on Sri Lankan history, but I would say it's actually more on Sri Lankan history and mytho-history than mythology per se. Sri Lanka does have like a very rich uh, tradition of demonology. We have like exorcisms and a whole kind of like cast of characters, but I haven't used any of them too directly. Like none of the devils match up to like the Sri Lankan devil masks, for example. I'm evoking them, but I'm not literally using any of them as such. But I did want that sense of multiplicity, I guess. The idea that there's a lot, that this invisible world is very large, and people with like its own kind of like ecosystem, I guess, like which is not really like accessible or comprehensible to Fetter, and he's the only one who has even some idea of of all of this. Everyone else can't see them, so their mythology of the devils is more abstract and more distant. Like, ah, yes, so I've heard of such a thing. There's like, yeah, there are stories about devils, but they don't think of it as like a real immediate thing. Whereas for Fetter, it's like he at least has kind of there's immediate reality for him that he has to deal with. So for that, I think like I was trying to evoke like that kind of like sense of a devil haunted world, to kind of mangle a Carl Sagan quote. But yeah, no, I was not like, I don't think there are any of the devils or any of the other like aspects can map directly to anything. The historical aspects maybe like the story of how the Bevettin kind like lands on the beach is very much like a reference to the Vijaya story, for example. For example, the thing he does with the mountain range is not in anything. I just made that up. That's not in anything.
But it was a really interesting moment, I guess. Like, you know, how like it really painted like the book, I guess, in a very different kind of light, that like the people who colonize and occupy us, they essentially mangle our own stories, that of our origin stories, our own mythos and our own mythology. Because like even like to the extent that it changes the modern day, like for example with the city of Luriat itself, like I found it really interesting that like the whole world map was kind of turned upside down. I think.
You got that.
Yeah.
I mean, that was like one thing I kind of like. I had like some kind of inkling in the beginning, like, maybe the world's upside down. That's why everything's from down south. And then like when he with the story, I found out like, oh yes, definitely, like the world is upside down. There's a mountain range now, and this is how it is. And like
Relatively few people have mentioned that one to me, so I'm not sure if people are like noticing it. I guess it doesn't really matter if you notice it or not.
Yeah,
but
yeah.
like,
I was also curious, is this story based explicitly on the island of Sri Lanka, or is it another world that is part of a bigger continent? But so I was on the lookout for any geographical hints. It's like, wait, the pointed edge is downward.
with the quote unquote island forming a peninsula up at the very tip. I mean, like that was like the point that like yes, the world is indeed upside down. Like I have it in my notes even.
it just
Why
seemed
world
like
upside down?
it just seemed like both an easy way to create a map that I didn't have to draw. And also like quite literally turning the world upside down, because I mean the idea that like the reason north is up is purely convention to
Exactly.
begin with, right?
Yeah, that's the very first thought after I figured it out, that like that came to me, like having our north is very like a convention kind of thing. Like someone just said that way is north now, and everyone just kind of went along with it. I mean,
yeah, I think there are some old maps where east is up,
Exactly.
which is even weirder if you think about it. So
and like I mean,
So-
these like small changes to our interpretation and our like understanding of the world have very deep, I guess, implications even in our modern age. I mean, you can understand like I think modern day like terminology has even shifted from first world, third world countries, like the terminology around there, to global north and global south. And
yeah, because
like
one's on top and the other one's below.
one's on top and the other one's on the bottom. And like
Yeah,
they've
no one can
been
explain why Australia is in the global north.
exactly.
Yeah.
No, personally, I still say third world just to annoy people. I'm like, we can say it.
I mean, we can say it, yeah. I mean, we were a third world country. I mean, like by that notion, you could say Pakistan was a first world country. Where's our rights, bro, on the global stage?
I mean, Sri Lanka is technically 7 degrees north of the equator, so I mean, if we're going to get technical about it.
Okay, so take us through your journey to publication, because before we started recording, you mentioned that there isn't a big publishing industry in Sri Lanka. So how do people go about writing books as you have done?
Okay, so like in there are definitely pressers, and like I think like in the 70s and 80s, the self-publishing was the norm. Like you would essentially pay for your own books to be printed, then handle the distribution to bookstores yourself, and half the time I think like pick up like returns by hand, which is like clearly like a gigantic pain in the ass. So it wasn't great. There were a few medium-sized pressers that could handle that end of things for you, but they weren't like taking like contracts from everyone. Obviously I was not writing then. I was this is like what I understand of like the 20th century kind of model. Now we have, I think, several still small pressers which would give you a contract and no doubt a small advance, handle the distribution, that sort of thing. So there is something there now, but it's very small, and very small in English, especially like in Sinhala and Tamil it's a little better, I think, but not by much. It's essentially non-existent on the scale of like the South Asian publishing industry, much less the global publishing industry. So I never set out to publish in Sri Lanka in the first place, because like I'm not doing all this if I'm not getting paid for it.
So is it possible? I mean, in South Asia, I believe India would probably be the biggest.
India would be the
publisher,
biggest,
right?
yeah, and there are plenty of, I think, Sri Lankan writers who publish with Indian publish, and now we have like big five like branches in India, like so HarperCollins India, that sort of thing.
So why
publishing-
didn't you publish in India, and why did you?
Well, because
one
like
of
if
these
you
big five?
if you want to get paid, right, as a writer,
Yeah.
if you want like a decent deal, because you spend like months, if not years, working on a novel, and most books, as we learned in the in the information unwillingly squeezed out of like Penguin Random House and Simon and Schuster during that trial, which was made public in the trial proceedings, is that like publishers A have no idea which books will sell, and B, they don't really make a big effort to sell most of their books, not anymore. What they do is they put the bulk of their marketing budget behind like relatively few books.
Yeah.
And those like are the ones that get like massive placements in bookstores. You know those table displays that you see like the where there's like a whole table of one book. So those
Atomic
are like the
Habits.
yeah. And like most of that is nonfiction, and like the handful of like whatever fiction bestsellers, and like celebrity biographies or whatever are cookbooks, whatever is selling like that season. And the rest of the front list, the books that are the new books of that season, are essentially I don't even know, like they trial them out, see if anybody bites. Sometimes one of them will take off. The rest of them will quickly go out of print. Used to be they would slowly go out of print. Now they'll quickly go out of print. And like a great many books don't get a marketing push at all.
Yeah.
So like they won't get like advance copies sent out to reviewers. They won't get like advertising. So that there's the lead titles, there's the ever shrinking middle list, and then there's the kind of the bottom of like a large number of books where the authors are treated quite badly by like publishers. So, and then there's the small presses, the independent presses, which are not owned by the big five, but correspondingly also have a lot less money. So like the amount of money you can get paid like is a lot less, and the amount of money they can put towards marketing is a lot less, and the amount of money that sloshes around in publishing in the West is astronomically like large compared to like what's available in South Asia. So if you want to make even like a modest, publishing is not a big business really for like the vast majority of people. It's a modest living. And it's modest
like
living
being a musician, right?
Yeah, exactly. It's like being like if you have like another job, or if you're like freelancing, like I'm a freelance editor on the side. That's just how you like you do something else to live on, and then like on the side, like you have this going on. Unless you're like one of the rare superstar writers, whose names we all know, the Stephen Kings and whatnot. And that's mostly because Stephen King like made his name back in the day when there was more opportunity to get that kind of push.
Yeah, I mean it's the same, right? Larry David's 100 millionaire as a writer, and nowadays writers get $20 for writing episodes of Suits, which
kind of thing. Yeah, and like this whole the writer's strike right now, we're all finding out how little money like the writers get paid for the residuals on shows that were like globally popular for months on end, and this guy's got like a check for like $20 or whatever, and like how is that even like how does that make sense? How does it make sense? So this is exactly why there's this whole AI push as well, I think, is to like kind of further drive down the prices. It's like, okay, you guys can strike, but we'll just replace you and then rehire you to fix the crappy AI scripts on contract. So this is the big like push, and it's even worse, I think, that for actors, they're trying to like license people's likenesses in perpetuity.
It's not a great deal. Bringing them in for a day.
Like
them, keeping it forever.
Like if you're a Hollywood A-lister, that's one thing, but like most people are not Hollywood A-listers. So publishing is just like that. Like the vast majority of writers are not A-listers. I'm certainly not an A-lister.
So as you are.
So my strategy was like, I'm gonna go for the best deal that I can get, which for me was absolutely not publishing in Sri Lanka, because there's nothing here, and like South Asia was like India I would have tried if Western publishers weren't working, but I got lucky. And I think like I had the slight advantage of having been publishing in short fiction for some time, so I had a little bit of name recognition among agents and editors. And I think that helped, because like when I said I have another manuscript out, there were people who were like, oh, okay, this guy, we know his name at least. We've seen him in anthologies. Got a short story up for an award one time. I didn't win, but I was nominated. So that kind of thing helps. You can build a little bit of a name for yourself in that. Like no one pays attention to short fiction in the greater world, but like people in publishing do. So there's that. So like agents, editors, other writers, those are the people who tend to read short fiction like a lot. So you can build
Makes
name for
sense.
yourself in short fiction and then kind of parlay that into a novel career. It takes time, a lot of like effort. So that was the path I took. There's a lot of paths you can take. A lot of like the Sri Lankan writers have like done quite well. Like Shihan Karunatilaka, for example, the who won the Booker Prize like this year. His book was originally published in Sri Lanka. Then he got in touch with an indie press, I think, in the UK, through some kind of like connection, because he had worked with one of the editors before on something else. So it's like that. You do what you can. You get a foot in the door where you can, and then it was a cool press, and they worked as hard for him as they possibly could. They got the book out in front of award juries, and like he got the big Booker win. The big Booker win got that. So the Booker is like a major award, right?
Yeah,
So
yeah.
that gets your book like stocked in bookstores. So I've been like everywhere I've been in the world in the last like year, I have seen copies of The Seven Moons of Malia Almeida like on bookstores, and that's great. That's really great. Like in Sri Lanka, in India, in the US, wherever, I have not seen a single bookstore that did not stock a copy, at least one copy of The Seven Moons. So that's like the high profile end of what like a big award win can get for you.
Yeah.
Even if you've technically didn't get a big 5 deal, that was not a big 5 deal. That was an indie press, right? And of course, a lot of so that's the business.
So I guess your decision to write the book in English also ties into this, right? To have a broader audience.
Yeah, I was just about to mention not writing in your native language, a book that was like, I felt like this book was kind of like a love letter towards Sri Lankans, you could say.
Yeah.
But like
yeah,
it was also manufactured for, I guess, wider audiences to consume. So like that's probably like a beneficial angle to take. Like for example, I guess one example could be like Khalid Hosseini writing about the problems in Afghanistan, and also like but he also geared the book to be available for like wider audiences and to be consumed by wider audiences, and he brought like a greater light upon said issues and problems that Afghanistan is facing and their political history and everything. So like I think you operated in a very similar kind of sense in that regard.
Yeah. I mean, I like my father was a writer like in the 70s and 80s. He wrote in Sinhala. So and he did fairly well by his own standards. He won a state literary award one time in the 80s for a short story collection. So that was fairly like high profile, like about as high profile as you could get as a writer in the 80s when that happened, right? And I know for a fact that he made basically no money. He covered his own costs, like, and that's about it. Right. So I had this insight into the Sri Lankan like publishing industry. So I was like, okay, so this is not a living. You can't like live like this. And he worked a government job his whole life. So I was like, I'm not going to have a government job my whole life. For one thing, I don't want to. And for another, you don't really like that kind of thing is a lot more precarious now than it used to be. Right?
Exactly. Yeah.
So I'm like, okay, if I want to actually like try and make a living mostly or entirely or mostly or at least significantly through my writing, I have to be publishing in the Western market. And to publish in the Western market, you have to write in English. And also I'm comfortable writing in English. I mostly read fiction in English because like a lot of like genre fiction, fantasy, science fiction is in English. Like the singular fiction is mostly literary fiction. There is some science fiction, I think, especially now, but it's very little of it. And a lot of it is very old-fashioned for my taste. So I grew up reading a lot of Arthur C. Clarke, that sort of thing. So I kind of like grew up in that Western tradition to begin with. So for me, like it was kind of a foregone conclusion that in publishing, I wanted to write this kind of thing and sell it in this kind of market. But at the same time, I wanted to write a book, write books in general, write fiction that I thought that was accessible and understandable to a Western audience or a global audience generally, but to Sri Lankans and to South Asians would have maybe a little bit extra, like a little
extra
something,
insight, a
little insight, like something that would feel familiar, like you get a little bit something out of it more than what like someone who has no familiarity with this culture, this history would. And I think that is a little bit from the so far relatively few South Asians have read the book. Because it's not here for sale yet in most places. I think.
I mean, that's
it will be like in the coming months, but like it isn't yet because the book just came out in the West. It's not even out in the UK yet, so it's still kind of rolling out.
It's rolling out in phases, yeah.
Reading it is much more personal than reading Tolkien, for example. Where
I thought
for us that world is an abstraction, a nice story, but reading The Saint of Bright Doors, it's hard not to take some things personally.
Yes. That was what I was hoping for.
Yeah, I think you achieved that
Yeah,
quite
you
well.
achieved that absolutely wonderfully. One more thing I would like to ask from you is like, what mistakes do you think that you made during the publishing process that you've learned from that you wouldn't want newer authors to fall into, like certain traps or certain like sets of thinking or even like strategies that you think are like not hollow but like don't think bode well in the future, like for them in order to get published?
Or was it a slam dunk the first try? You just swish.
Well, no, I mean, I'm an overthinker, right? So I planned all this like so far like ahead that you can't even call it a plan really, because so when you're like trying to work like 10 years ahead, like your plans are necessarily kind of broad strokes.
Exactly.
You're like, okay, I'm gonna like, and I was familiar enough with the industry that I kind of knew that I wanted to go like this very traditional route, especially in genre fiction. There has been like, for going back to like the pulp magazines of the the 1940s and 50s in the States, there's been this kind of like traditional trajectory of like, okay, first you publish short stories in magazines, you make a name for yourself, then you get an agent, and then like publish novels and so forth. So that's what you might call the very traditional like path. And that's like, if you go back and look at like advice to writers published like in the the 20th century, late 20th century, that's what like old people will tell you to do. And that's not necessarily good advice now, because now you have like all these like opportunities with self-publishing and so forth. And all the other like options, like you can be a hybrid writer. You can like like if you're like very prolific, for example, like if you're producing a lot of work, you can try a mixture of both approaches. But for me, I think like I planned out my approach so early, and I set like this like I set myself on this path like fairly like intentionally, that like so I knew like what steps I was going to take. I was like, okay, there are these like 3 or 4 like basic steps. I'm going to follow this like thing because I want to do this the old school way kind of thing. Because I have no idea if the old school way still even works, but it works enough, right? It works to the extent that you're not like, and I'm not good at marketing, right? Like if you're self-publishing, you have to be good at marketing. You have to do that end of it yourself, and that's not the part of the work that I want to do. I want to be one of those writers who writes books and hands it over to like a publisher and says, okay, now you do the part that you're geared to do, the production, the printing, the distribution, the placement in bookstores, the marketing, the advertising, the dealing with distributors and booksellers. It's a whole thing, right? There is a whole kind of ecosystem there, especially in the West, especially in the States. There's this whole massive like system that you can plug into, whereas if you're self-publishing, you kind of have to like do a whole lot of that work yourself, and that's not the part of the work that I'm good at. So figure out your strengths and play to them, I think, and do research, because there is like a wealth of information out there, and this is in a lot of ways a golden age for access, because in the last like 10 years a lot of publishers and agents started taking submissions electronically. Now, this is a very, very conservative industry, right?
Exactly. I mean, it's
like
very slow
email is a new thing to a lot of people. Like until
you're saying like that's a revolution.
Yeah, like I think this is also the reason that in the last 10 years, and increasingly so in the 10 years to come, like in the next few years especially, we're going to see like a sudden surge of like globally writers like publishing in the West, getting like bigger deals and like publishing with like major publishers. And I think one thing I've noticed with like a lot of Sri Lankan writers, especially the ones who haven't published, like the ones I speak to, don't necessarily know that this is possible yet. Like that this idea that you can actually publish outside the country, it's not that hard. Like you don't have to spend money to do it. You can just email your manuscript to people. Maybe they'll say no, fine, you did. It was free either way, right?
The cost of entry is a lot lower.
The cost of entry is very low now. So like I think like, and I know for a fact that we have like a bunch of South Asian writers from South Asia whose novels are coming out from big 5 publishers in the next like 2-3 years, and that's all like a thing that is possible now that wasn't possible before. So I think this is a good time to get in on it, if and for anyone who has ambitions on this front.
One thing I think would finally end on, I guess, would be like, why is it important to talk about fantasy, and why is it important to write fantasy to even begin with? Especially like in a sphere like our South Asian, fantasy is like a very overlooked sphere of writing, I guess. It is present to some extent, but I guess it's very overlooked, very underrepresented. So why is it important to write fantasy novels about our mythos and about our culture and about our like circumstances?
I mean, on the one hand, I'm like, I don't know, is it important? Maybe it is. Maybe people should write whatever they. I do think it's important to write. Like, I do think like we need to say like a lot more. There was a truly horrific statistic. I don't remember the exact numbers now, but I remember the proportions, which is that from like, this is from a few years ago, but approximately speaking, the proportions were, so the population to writers, published writers ratio between the US and UK combined on the one hand and South Asia on the other. We have like 5 times or whatever as many people, and they have 5 times as many the writers.
Oh, I mean that's a pretty ugly statistic to look at.
Yeah, I mean, don't quote me on the exact numbers, but like, I mean, it was.
I
like,
mean, in general, like
data,
even like in general,
but like that was approximately the proportions as I remember it from a few years ago. So and those numbers are changing, but they're certainly not changing fast enough. And a hell of a lot more translators, because people writing in languages other than English should actually be having their work translated into English for the quote unquote global publishing audience, because I think that gets you like more money and more acclaim, more awards, etc. But one thing that like writers in third world can do to make money is take advantage of the arbitrage of like publishing in the first world and living at home, because the dollar still goes further here. Like what is essentially like a less than living wage in the West is still like a decent income if you're living in Sri Lanka or India or Pakistan.
Exactly.
So like, try, sell your manuscripts in the West and don't move.
That seems like a very profitable strategy, like if I say so.
Yeah, and there's also, I think, a good way of like building, maybe like take advantage of the infrastructure, I guess, in a way, is what I'm also saying. Like, because like there is a whole publishing industry there that is at least theoretically open to these manuscripts, right? And they can publish these books and distribute them back to South Asia, which is in a lot of ways easier than like getting like a decent like deal in South Asia itself.
Exactly. I mean, like,
so there is you can take advantage of that system. Like it takes some doing, kind of a lot of luck, but obviously it's worth a shot, and it's maybe one way of building up that literary culture, or broadening it rather. At least we already have like quite the extensive literary culture, but like expanding its reach into spaces where it's historically been denied.
As you said before in your own book, that like luck is the hard work of other people working in your favor.
Yes.
So why not take advantage of it? I guess that this is a nice point to close out. So do you have any last words to our audience that you would want to say?
Well, I suppose like conventionally, this is the point at which I would shill my next book. Which
by all means, shill all you want, shill everything.
It hasn't been announced yet, unfortunately. It will be announced sooner rather than later, in the coming months, I believe. You can check out my website at vajra.me. That's vajra.me. And I would also say, like, if you're interested in South Asian fantasy and science fiction, this is a good time to start to look around, because there's a whole bunch of books coming out in the next few months. There's my book, obviously, The Saint of Bright Doors. There's Samit Basu's Jinbot of Shantipur, which I think is due out in October, possibly September, which is like a science fiction novel with a South Asian setting.
Exactly. And one more thing, like you can even shoot out the links to me, and then I'll put them in the description down below. You can check them out, and then I'll have them available for you to see, like to save you a bit of the hard work of finding these authors. This is meaning the Q&A podcast with an absent Q. I think he left at the last moment, and we were here with Vajra Chandrasekera. Check out his book again, Saint of Bright Doors. Absolutely beautifully written book. and especially for like Pakistani South Asian audience, like I mean, it speaks a lot, very much from the heart, and it's like a love letter to all of our countries, and you can see ourselves in the book as Fetter as well. So hopefully we'll catch you again next week. Bye bye.
Thank you so much for having me.